Uh,
Will, he, him, best of luck.
okay, so that is everyone. I think all teams are here. Can everyone then give me their speaker positions and preferred pronouns, please?
Donna will be Prime Minister, Kiki will be DPM. Both of us prefer gender neutral pronouns. Thank you.
Okay, you. Oh. Opening opposition.
Yeah, this is Tony Wang. I will be the leader of opposition, gender pronoun he or they, and PY in the chat box. Thank you.
Josh will be going second in the DLO. I prefer being referred to by my speaker position, please. And I also prefer my POI in the chat. Thanks, friends.
Okay. CG.
Rena would be member of government. Yuichi would be government whip. No preferred gender pronouns. Thank you.
Okay. CO.
Hi, my name is Wenbin. I'll be speaking member. I prefer gender neutral language.
Hi, my name is Suyeon. I'll be speaking whip. I prefer to be addressed by name or speaker position. Thank you.
Okay, so I think that's everyone. Then, without further ado, for the grand finals in NEADC 2021, we would like to now invite the Prime Minister to open this debate for us. Here.
Yes, I'm audible.
Yes.
Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Firstly, how will this work? This is going to exactly look like prenups. Both sides would have the ability to have access to guidance from state or private institution. You have access to lawyers, family counselor. Secondly, you have premarital split up, how much property each side owns, and monetary proportion each side has to contribute, and also how much time they have to spend on child duty care and other specifics. 3, contracts can be changed as long as both sides consents to, or if one side is extremely abusive. For example, if there's domestic abuse, neglect of a partner, we think that these expectations could become a void. What is the problem that exists in the status quo? Number one, people oftentimes marry too quickly as a result of romanticization of marriage. Social media makes people watch highlight reels of other people in relationship. Like this means that you have unmet expectation. You have ideas, for example, like marriage gives you a safe space. 3, you have government policy offering tax benefit for a married couple. 4, you have beautification of marriage in movies, drama, entertainment industry, most likely to have incentive to depict bright side, because negative side would drive viewership away, positive side will feed into people's fantasy of love, and hence the memory will last longer. Why is this harmful? Number one, you are unlikely to be able to fully conceptualize the implication of getting married. This means you have less rational discussion about important stuff, potentially is a ticking time bomb of the future. Why do we be able to solve this? I think prenups is an agreement forces both sides to sit down, go through a rational discussion, go through a list of documents to be nitty-gritty about every single detail. But 2, you also have access to statistics, how other couples are dealing with it, and how successful they are as a sense of reference. I think that number 2, the second problem is that relationship actually evolves, right? Like, I think that the problem is like Sasko, like you have a lot of optimism bias. At first, you're blind due to hormone, right? You think that you're willing to do everything about the partner because you love them, because you think that person is soon to be a husband, or you think that the husband will help you to share that workload. But this promise might work in the short term, but as house chores become too troublesome, your husband might prioritize their feelings over you, right? Like, I think secondly, relationship become more complex as time passes because you have more burden. For example, you need to raise children, you need to finance houses, your financial obligations such as electricity bill, tuition fee, etc. Why is this particularly harmful, right? I think this is particularly harmful when both sides just simply sleepwalk into it, right? Like initially you're just dealing with your partner, but later on you also have to deal with family pressure, for example. Like other sides are pressuring you to have kids, for example, right? I think crucially, you have this contract to be able to show them, look, father-in-law, we signed this contract, we have an obligation, you should stay out of our life, right? But 2, oftentimes partners have false memory, they remember things wrong because of their own bias. So if you have this prenup, if you have this obligation, so this means that all of you will have to, for example, contribute, for example, spend time with your kids, for example, all things that's happened. But third reason why this is harmful, right? For example, the day-to-day operation is very mundane and unromantic. For example, fighting over where do you spend time, which channel to watch on TV. Secondly, buying bed sheets, right? Third thing, like discussing things like washing dishes and cleaning houses just makes you feel like your other partner does not care about you or love you whatsoever, right? I think the fourth reason why this is extremely harmful is, for example, like career woman, right? You have to sacrifice between staying a year and a half at home and taking care of your kids, like in the kids, right? I think that here's where I change. Notice that in status quo, women tend to have social power before the relationship starts. For example, in bar culture, right? Bars oftentimes allow women to enter free of charge. For example, this culture where men offers drink, right? But two, in terms of applications, for example, Tinder's, for example, which oftentimes give priority to women like Bumble, can choose whether or not they start a conversation. But three, societal conversation about protecting women, which means that women can decide if they want to progress with this relationship. And I think that initially, when you transit into the first few months, women is aware and hyper aware of this, and is evaluating this part of every single corner, right? I think this allows, crucially, this key window when the prenups can be done earlier, right? It changed at the start. Now, when you're able to settle down with your partner, right? And you decide to plan for your career, when your boss is asking you about promotion, whether or not they want to give you a promotion, whether or not they want to have mentorship, you can show them, boss, I can fully commit to this job because I have this expectation, obligation with my spouse. The spouse is going to help me to be able to take care of children, for example, right? Look, I think that their side, they're going to try to talk about how people will be uncomfortable. Two reasons why this is not true. Number one, you're likely to normalize it when everyone else is doing it. But number two, the state can also incentivize campaign or production of film to break this taboo, like involving money into love. So I think this example of like Singapore, how they have this national campaign to have more people get married, they have incentive to do so, and also because of declining of population and also high marriage rate means instability of society. Thirdly, I'm going to argue why necessarily this is going to be better for marriage. Number one, in terms of communication barrier, couples exist on a spectrum. Some prefer to be more romantic, others prefer to be more practical. For example, one person wants to save money to buy a house, other want to have big families, other do not want to have kids. I think the problem here is that in our culture, we do not say explicitly the expectation or obligation. Oftentimes, we don't necessarily remember it. How work is distributed, there's an expectation for the other side to understand. Because of media portrayal, people can read their mind because of chemistry. Now, here's where it changes. Number one, because of expert help, right? Because of different perspective. Imagine you're sitting down in a negotiation. This expert lawyer are putting the agreement into perspective. For example, how much the partner have to support each other. If I give Kiki $500 a month, then it's easier for me to say it because there's a professional there to guide me. This is something that's necessary, right? Whether or not something is commonly done, for example, hours each other spend on each other, right? I think experts can suggest idea which put things that are relatively shameful and hard to say out there. But two, you can also likely to have counter negotiation. Before I explain counter negotiation, I'll take CO.
Yeah, would you say that an average person has access to a personal lawyer and oftentimes is able to make the most fair contracts?
I would say that as a result of countries, for example, like Singapore with decreasing population, China, for example, or in general, you want to have people to be happy with marriage, for example, to have more kids, or breaking glass to have gender equality. I think there's an incentive for state to actively do so. But even if it's not lawyers, I think you can still have counselors, etc. Right? I think in terms of counter negotiation, one, within an area, I think that partners can decide to horse trade. For example, right, if this partner decides to go heavily on house chore, that is crucially when the other partner has to write on paper how much money they contribute, right? Even if they cannot do house chores, for example, they still have to do things, for example, like taking care of kids, taking care of elderly. This allows a lot of flexibility. I think both sides can negotiate for concession, especially I think the crucial delta here is, for example, even if men do not want to take house chore like I myself, I still do this because I might not have like a money, for example, right? These are the things that can happen. I think two, this can also prevent the overgiving from one side to give back. As a result of this implicit bias, the other side understands you. One side oftentimes gives too much, one side likes the other more, so they spend too much time. Oftentimes there's burnout because there's no reciprocation, right? I think that you're able to change this romantic-sized image because the normative marriage is now going to improve. It involves both romantic pursuit and also security. Both sides can imagine how they can provide for each other, how to divide work. This reduces anxiety facing the ever uncertain world. We're extremely proud to propose.
We'd like to thank the Prime Minister for that fine speech. We now invite the Leader of Opposition to begin the opposition bench of the House. Here. Hello? Is it just me or can no one else hear?
We cannot hear.
Tony, are you speaking right now? Okay. Yeah. Look, Tony, are you speaking right now? Because if yes, can't hear you still.
All right, judges, I have Tony here now on my phone. Are you able to hear him?
Hello. Hello, can you hear me? I am there.
Yeah, we can. Can you say something a bit longer just so we can check the audio quality?
Okay. I'll speak longer to test if this is stable or not. Is it stable or not?
Yeah, that's good enough.
All right. So sorry for this, and I'll set up my notes. Sorry for this. My speech will start in 3, 2, 1, now. Having a negotiation doesn't mean this negotiation is going to look like the utopia government is going to look like. So I'm going to disprove this. I'm going to further prove to you why this will further disenfranchise the disadvantaged women at relationship and make even the best form of relationship really toxic. Before I move on, 2 pieces of engagement towards government side, PM said. Firstly, they argue about how this current medium fetishization that make people believe the marriage is good and make them move to marriage quickly. We reject this for 2 fronts. Firstly, given the fact that current birth rate is really low, and given the fact that a lot of society experience a lot of rampant of patriarchy, so that's why a lot of people remain unmarried. If you look at the status of China, so it's empirically untrue that people are rushing to marriage to begin with. Secondly, even if that's the case, we still think that there's an equal amount of mediatization of the harms, of a potential harms and threats in the marriage as well. If you look at trendy family marriage like a TV series on the Netflix are depicting harm, that people are very aware of those issues. And secondly, they argue about how this this negotiation is going to make you foresee the harms potential probably in the future. I'm going to tell you firstly, if the only mechanism they give us is documentary or media portrayal, like it's also vulnerable to the harms of this media portrayal, is fetishizing and glorify the marriage in the good side and not showing the bad side on their side of the house. The harm is equally occurred. Secondly, we don't think that textbook of marriage is going to be representative to people's real experience. There are several things we're going to talk about. Firstly, why we think the problem is not that severe. Secondly, why principle is unjust. And thirdly, why we think it's going to make a relationship really bad, and fourthly, why it disadvantages women. So firstly, why we don't think the problem is that severe, so they deny the necessity of this. Firstly, we think that currently we already have all the alternatives that PM beautifully characterized for us, like marriage counseling, peer counseling, whatsoever. They can utilize this to mitigate and negotiate harm beforehand. And secondly, because of the ongoing trend of liberalization, success of feminism, making people more aware of the issues of the relationship, so that people tend to be more cautious, prudent, and rational about this. And thirdly, a lot of people just try first living together before entering a relationship. And fourthly, a lot of times, people are quite used to communicating with this. So that's why the problem is not severe. Secondly, what principle is unjust, we think that the state do not have a right or do not have ability and power to intervene in this regard. Firstly, we think that a lot of this issue doesn't really have a morally correct answer to begin with. The personal issues of states do not have say in this. And secondly, even if there's a correct answer, states do not have a whole epistemic best knowledge in that otherwise the individuals that know them the best. So analogies here, that's why we also don't let state dictates the abortion issue or whatsoever. It's up to the people, so it's principally unjustified to intervene. Secondly, why we think that even the best form of negotiation happen on their side is going to result into bad relationship, and this is the most important impact in our debate. Firstly, we think that people are organically, systematically more likely to change in the dynamic, with the flow of time in a marriage. So this contract or this stipulation is going to make the relationship really stagnant and harm the quality of the relationship. I have 6 reasons for this. A, people currently endure a lot of change within the marriage. For example, your habit of life, for example, your perception of the devotion of your romantic relationship, etc. The economic and social conditions also changing through the passage of life. But if you conscripted this at the beginning of a marriage as something so stagnant, it will lead to 4 or 5 folds of harms. Firstly, it is simply meaningless to stick to the old taxes and the condition that doesn't really reflect the reality, the changing dynamic of your relationship. And secondly, it is really hard to opt out because you need to constantly satisfy that obligation being conscripted in those contracts. And thirdly, it's going to make a marriage look really stagnant, which discourages a lot of people from entering into relationship or discourage them have a willingness to enjoy this relationship in a marriage. And fourthly, it is going to form a pessimistic view of this marriage being something like it is a stagnant condition. You need to stick forever for your lifetime. So that's why when people have alienation towards this condition, it will easily cause into conflict and quarreling, so condemning other people, why you don't stick to the condition we're offered or whatsoever, why you're not fulfilling my expectation, given the fact that people's ability to fulfilling of the obligation and expectation also change accordingly. So that's why in majority of time it is going to fail, and that's why quarreling and conflict more likely happen. And fourthly, it causing this binary division of you are a good husband or not because of fulfillment of these things. It denies the dynamic or the different conditionality of the relationship. The importance of this, it is going to hugely destroy the experience and the happiness to occur during this marriage. A lot of time you just looking at that holy Bible of conditionality and feel that all days have passed and feel pessimistic and unhappy on a daily basis. And secondly, it is also important that the delta and the irreversibility of this is because it constrains your expectation, your imagination of marriage into singular and unchanged formats of a piece of paper, of a contract, right? Comparatively on our side of the house, we're more likely to like people feel that, okay, when my economic status changes, when our view about a relationship changes, we're okay to negotiate a new form of a relationship dynamic or whatsoever. Compared on their side of the house, it's more likely for them to actually feel that this is something we need to stick to. There's no other imagination is allowed. Secondly, why we think women are disproportionately disadvantaged in this contract. Right. So that's why this answer to their utopia about how it's going to give a lot of leverage, negotiation, compromise, concession. Why we think that's unlikely to happen. We think a society is still largely very patriarchal, the vast majority of society, right? Weighing on the numbers of people getting into marriage, a lot of them are situated in a society condition that's largely patriarchal. What do I mean by this? Firstly, it is going to discourage people from entering into marriage at all, right? Because you'll be like, oh, this is so horrific. I cannot win over my partner because I'm powerless. That's why this remains single. And given the fact that society still has stigma towards single women, they are going to be constant victim towards this stigmatization. Secondly, it will disadvantage them and consolidate that disadvantage systematically, because oftentimes men in a patriarchal society have more bargaining power in the negotiating terms, and oftentimes they have more external supporting structure. Their family, friends, and the society all telling you that men should be the one who design the relationship, design the marriage, and lead the way, right? And certainly they are going to internalize through the mediatization education of your life. So that's why women are oftentimes feel intrinsic inferiority. That's why they're less likely to have a good negotiation or whatsoever. And fourthly, even if you want to negotiate, they simply don't have a language as the societal language is disproportionately being framed by men or whatsoever. Even if they claim best version of marriage, the only goes to the most privileged one, where vast majority of people are stuck into a marriage. The only men take more advantage and stagnant and never change. It's a miracle. It's a nightmare that we should not follow. So all of it's opposed.
Okay. We thank the leader of opposition for that fine speech. We now invite the Deputy Prime Minister to continue the case from the opening government side. Here. DPM.
Am I audible?
Yep.
Okay. Sorry. Hold on, yeah. I will take the PO in the chat, preferably from closing up. Yeah. Opposition tried to run the patriarchy argument by saying that why men will still always have more leverage over the decision. Number one, I don't think this is true because as Tony analysis, there's a progressive trend, right? Countries do have incentive to liberate more women force into tackling the kind of shrinking population. Therefore, you see a lot of politicians already offering women to engage in STEM subject to actually boost R&D, to also increase the kind of economic production, right? But second, because obviously companies want to do it for some kind of corporate social responsibility or even PR, right? Because when majority of consumers are females, they also still want to show some kind of solidarity with gender equality, especially when the rise of the idea of gender inequality was quite relevant in social media, which means that companies do have incentive to help that. All of this prove that there's a progressive trend for women to be more financially empowered. So I don't think it's necessarily true that women will always be at lower end during this negotiation process. But second, is it really true that women are really systematically disfranchised? I don't think so, right? Because this doesn't really engage with nuances from Donna, right? Because Donna often point out that women actually have more social power before marriages, right? Look at like how women are slightly more picky than men, for example. Usually just swipe left comparatively more than men. Look at the Tinder statistical report. But second, when women are actually selecting their partner, they usually have imposed some kind of criteria. For example, men have to have some kind of caste, financial stability on houses. Therefore, I think women usually have more choices in selecting the mate, right? But also, if you look at a statistic where women actually get before they get married, right? I think women and men are equally compatible. Women consist majority of the university graduates. You also have women holding like managerial position. Therefore, I think the delta here is comparatively better in OG because I prefer that this asset belong to me even after I get married because these are things that I should fight for, right? Because the comparative that opposition has to defend is three things. Number one, optimism bias, right? You might not specify, you are unlikely to specify the kind of like boundary or like who actually get the kind of like asset because you assume that your counterparts love you too much to the extent that you're willing to make the kind of like sacrifices, right? Your counterpart also might think that you already consented that to sacrifice the family, especially when there exists a narrative that women should spend more time in home after marriage because they're the closest biological agent to the kids, right? Therefore, we think that it's very hard for women to really voice out after marriage, right? But second, I think because after you opt into relationship, it's like you literally don't have any kind of bargaining chip left because you're more likely to be the victims of moral kidnapping, right? For example, your elderly or even your mother are going to say that you should really fit your child because men are probably bad at this job, right? You should be the one that actually do that because other females also doing that. You'll have the kind of glorification of motherhood. But thirdly, I think oftentimes women's work after marriage in home is not monetarily valued. For example, house chores because your partner cannot really see it, and also they feel like it's justified because other people are also doing that, which means it's very hard for you to complain. So any kind of attempt for you to complain are more likely to be seen as being bitchy and whining about that, right? At least under I think you'll get to be nitpicky about everything, right? Because you have like access to experts sitting you guys down to talk about things to help you to conceptualize what the life will look like after marriage. You're more likely to have this kind of rational discussion. I think this is time sensitive, right? Because I think that you really need to do it when your partner still really love you, so that they are more likely to make some kind of concession. You're more likely to carry out some kind of like rational discussion, right? I also think that you are able to access to database, which means that you also have a sense of guidance to how other couples are also doing that, therefore preventing the kind of like moral kidnapping that you actually suffer after marriage. The next thing that I will say is that the status quo is not the severe, therefore you don't need that. Three responses. Number one, if that is true that the structure is improving, then your claim about patriarchy does not stand. You have to pick one. But second, you can claim that the structure is improving. I don't really care. But the problem is, it again doesn't engage with the nuance of Donna, right? Because Donna pointed out it doesn't really it doesn't really matter how external factors operate. It's about human psychology. You always want to think that you are the special one. Therefore, oftentimes in relationship, you don't really ask like opinion from like maybe your family's a friend because you probably believe that your the one that you found is literally a soulmate is literally the best one, right? But thirdly, I think, but again, in case Josh wants to say that I'm being contradictory, no, because database allows you to actually access to more data. You're more likely to take these opinions from data instead of one parent or like one friend, because you're more likely to think that they're probably just quite sour about my relationship. But thirdly, if Tony is correct that this is not that severe, then they probably are quite liberal anyway. Therefore, and this further proved Donna's point about why people are less likely to be resistant about that, therefore getting more buy-in. I will say that, Tony say that this drama can be realistic. Number one, I think this is about the degree of extent, right? I think majority of this drama would still beautify this kind of things because they want to insert a lot of advertisement into that. They want to boost a lot of viewers because majority of viewers do have some kind of fantasy about like relationship. They still want to look at some kind of beautiful things, right? And also like positive things basically make them stay longer. But second, it's not only movies, right? You only attack our first mechanism. It's all about the idea of like culture, like Confucianism, like family actually are able to take care of you during safe space of financial crisis or whatsoever. All of this means that people will still unrealistically beautify marriage to the extent that they cannot conceptualize what happened, right? Still say that we do not have fiat to argue the accessibility of service. For responses, number one, I think people at law firm at the spectrum, you have like altruistic law firms or whatsoever, also activists offering like public oath for free of charge. But second, if this is mandatory, which the motion says, which means that literally state has the incentive for some kind of burden to offer some for the affordable services. If not, it basically makes no sense, right? Because citizens are more likely to call that out. But thirdly, before I move on, Yasio.
If there is access to existing data, how would you say that that data is good and benevolent? And often that data would also reflect the biases that already exist in society.
No, the access to data is very holistic, right? If you learn math, you can understand it's not just a single calculation of culture. You also study how people's marriage. It also measure like people's happiness after they opt for different kind of marriage style. Therefore, you're more likely to take like good reference. But thirdly, if this is mandatory, means that people need it. Therefore, you incentivize more law firms to offer affordable services. But fourth, economic skill, right? It's easier in long run because when this become mandatory, everyone can just ask information and ask suggestions with each other. Therefore, it's not even important. I will say this will result in co-relationship. Obviously, some humanistic trait exists, right? The contract is not just co-condition, yes or no, right? Obviously, you have some kind of room of maneuver. You also have some kind of exception that you are able to do. For example, if you're sick, for example, you're just so tired, right? But second, obviously, you're not co because you understand your partner might be just too tired from the work. Therefore, there's no point making a big fuss about that because you also don't want your marriage to fail because you also love your partner to some extent, probably. Therefore, you're more likely to, agree with some kind of like misalignment, right? But thirdly, Donna point out, if this agreement is just too cold and too like problematic, you can negotiate as long as both sides agree, therefore change this thing. In the end of the day, we prove why this is better for relationship, why this actually help women more. Propose.
I thank the Deputy Prime Minister for that fine speech. We now invite the Deputy Leader of Opposition to continue the case from the opening opposition. Here.
Are you able to hear me okay?
Yep.
Okay. Let's get this party started. 4 things in this speech. 1, looking at lower socioeconomic contexts that are laced with conservatism. Secondly, looking at hyper-progressive context, which the DPN consent is probably the most likely scenario in this debate. 3rd, challenging the ways in which this is a problem-solution mismatch, and you're unlikely to even come up with the types of problems that a contract would be able to identify, and therefore you see no solvency. But then 4thly, the ways in which this constrains personal change and growth, and the ways that a relationship can and should evolve to the extent to which it creates a constriction of an identity growth and a constriction of the ways in which relationships can provide utility to us as they change along with us, versus creating a static archetype 20 years ago that we constantly refer back to and limit our own personal growth, limit the own capacity of the relationship. First, how does this look like in hyper-conservative context? I think this is probably not the motion where this debate is taking place most often, because when states are implementing it in these contexts, they are doing so from conservative perspectives, which means that OGs, experts, are introduced into this concept to try and extract asymmetric benefits to the men in those situations as much as possible. I'll also note that a lot of their mechanisms about, for example, loving your partner early on in a relationship equally apply to women in these contexts, which means regardless of state coercion or individual incentives that they've beautifully characterized for us, there's probably a huge asymmetry. What's the actual delta though, and why does it mean it's worse on their side? Because versus just being an asymmetry that's left up to families to negotiate, which later on, if there are changes, such as the introduction of socioeconomic opportunity for that woman, such as, for example, the insertion of the transnational surrogacy industry into that community, there is now a legal document that was signed upon by that woman that the family then gets to instrumentalize and prevent that woman from extracting and changing her life. What that means is that she gets the opportunity, for example, become a surrogate or enter into e-commerce, instead of being able to keep that money herself. When the aid organization, when the international body goes to provide her the money, the family can now make a legal claim that was arbitrated with experts by the state in order to make the claim that the money should go to the husband or to the family, not to the woman, which means not only is it the same, but it's far worse in terms of the ability for women to be able to leave those situations, even in best case scenarios where socioeconomic opportunity arises, which, as the DPM characterizes, happening more and more in a globalized world, which means you slow down their ability to access that globalization and secure their own economic utility. But secondarily, in a more progressive context, which I'll also note is probably the more frequent one, because that's where people would even have the option, or it would even be talked about whether or not we should engage in this type of policy when the state sets it. I think that states have a pretty high barrier to step in and infringe on personal choice. I think that states have a pretty a priori moral duty to maximize choice. Why? Because the ways in which we were born into the social contract sees that we trade over resources to the state on the expectation that they will maximize our choice as much as possible. This is hyper amplified by the fact that we give the state a monopoly on violence, which means that the only way that we can proportionally make up for that is by maximizing choice in every other aspect of our life to make up of the lack of choice that we traded over to the state. Why is this significant? One, because we don't consent into this. We're born into a state without signing it, and most people don't have the capital to be able to move, or don't perceive themselves to be able to move because of state propagandizing and nationalism that makes you feel tied to the place that you're in, which means that maximization of choice is an even more important utility when you can't leave that contract. But the second thing is that choice is a prerequisite to seeing the benefits of utility. So all the benefits that open government talks about are based on people feeling like they had a choice in it versus being chained or shackled into it by a contract that makes you experience utility of that value less and makes you ascribe less value to it because you feel more forced into it. Why do I think the state doesn't meet the problematization that they would have to show in terms of the huge problem that is either has widespread scale, seriously intense intensity, or would be irreversible, which then justify the state stepping in to protect our choice by infringing it in a certain way? I think they've comprehensively failed to show this. Why? One, because the DPM literally made a massive concession about the ways in which we're seeing liberalization all over the world, which they then characterize comes hand in hand with the increased ability of women to negotiate relationships, which comes hand in hand with the increased criticality of the ways in which we engage with an understanding of marriage and propping up divorce rates. Let me mech this out further for the DPM. I think that there's a counter narrative that's been created in most progressive societies around marriage for two reasons. One, because marriage has often been irreversible in the past, and two, because it's often quite expensive to get into and expensive to get out to. So it's created a counter narrative that encourages people to date as much as possible before they get into that relationship, which nukes a lot of the opening government benefits about not knowing what shows to watch when you're like hanging out with each other, or not really understanding what the distribution of labor is going to be, because the average person is dating for a far more amount of time. But then furthermore, why the problematization is not great enough to justify state intervention is because Tony told you about the plethora of alternatives that exist. Things like marriage counseling, things like living together, things like, I'll add, states expanding definitions of marriage to include, for example, more polyamorous marriages, like what just happened in Virginia, which means that there's a greater variety of marriages that you can get into that decreases your perceived pressure of feeling like you need to get into it, because you know whenever you need to, there's a marriage that fits the type of lifestyle that you're in. Or just like the liberalization of divorce in terms of the same media they're talking about, showing divorce, making it look like a good thing, having movies that justify it and show empowerment to go through that process, all of which means that there is a huge problem with the ways in which they've characterized romanticization to be so coercive that it needs state intervention. But I would also characterize that the people who are most likely to engage in this contract to the degree at which they want, at which it would actually achieve what they want, are people who have the most capital, therefore the most rich. These are people whose relationships would probably already be better and who would have the capital to leave, which again means that the policy is whom it's most likely to affect is where it's problematized the least, which means it's the least justified for the state to intervene there. But the second problem with their case is that they literally don't explain why you're likely to identify problem areas. They identify that problems occur in your relationship, but not why you're likely to identify them through this process. They simply say, experts will help you. I think that experts can identify the kind of shit that your parents fight about on a day-to-day basis, reflect on this and gut check. One, because the types of things your parents fight about come from personal changes that you couldn't ever predict. Things like reckoning with your gender, reckoning with your sexuality, reckoning with socio-political views as a result of a changing environmental context that you couldn't predict when you're sitting in that lawyer's office at 5 p.m. on a Tuesday. I think secondarily, it comes from crises like pandemics and economic things. I think thirdly, it comes from having a lack of previous experience with the types of crises that exist, which means you underestimate or misestimate how it is that you would respond in that context. Fourthly, because the types of experts that they talk about are things that low-income families can't afford a good one, which means you get a low-income public servant who has way too many caseloads and is unable to meaningfully help you arbitrate that. I think sixthly, because the ways in which they talk about burnout are not things that you predict because it's a slow, pernicious process that you haven't experienced yet in a relationship, and you can't predict how the problem will manifest, and therefore you're unable to create a contract that would prevent you from experiencing it anyways. CG. All right, well, that's sad. Okay, what this also means is that even if you disregard everything that I've said, they fail to comprehensively show why marriage contracts end up being orbited in ways that identify the problems that they want to solve. Another reason OG is out that CG will have to overcome. But the third and most damning thing are the ways in which we change organically over our lifestyle as a result of more data inputs, meeting new people, having more time to reconcile with the understandings in ourselves, which is why we change in terms of our relationship to our identity and our gender and our sexuality, our socio-political views, which means you are shackling people into a contract that does not represent whom they are, either of them, most cases, down the line, which means a couple of things that Tony told you that never saw response. One, it justifies people restricting other partners' developments on the basis of a contract from 20 years ago. Secondarily, it justifies people convincing and family pressures, peer pressuring you into staying into a marriage that isn't good for you anymore on the basis that you signed into something 20 years ago. Thirdly, it creates more conflict on the expectation that the marriage will remain static versus allowing the relationship to evolve. This is where I flip open government thing where you say, you forget about what you were like when you signed it. That's a good thing because you both have changed, and it's better to evolve along with your relationship. That's especially true given the global democratization trend means that people are likely changing in more liberal ways, which means they're being chained to previous less liberal versions of themselves on a likelihood basis. I think the final thing is that families-in-law are also more justified in pressuring you not to change on the basis that you agreed to something with their child, with their daughter, with their son, and even if it's a perfectly justifiable change, you've given them more ammunition to lock you into that place where you don't access your own identity, you don't access fulfillment of happiness, you're not able to be good for your partner, you're not able to be good for yourself. I honestly think it's right shit. Proud to oppose.
Thank the Deputy Leader of Opposition for that fine speech. We now invite the Member of Government to begin the closing half of the debate. Here. Member of Gov.
Can I check? Sorry, can I check that I'm audible?
Yes, you're here. We can hear you.
Thank you. Speech will start in 3, 2, 1. I think there's two issues with opening government's case. First, the majority of their case and impact is contingent on the people getting into a smooth, non-coercive marriage in the first place. They do not have a time frame to deal with the specific issues that might arise on our side after the marriage. But secondly, their context is specifically limited to privileged, developed, progressive, liberalized countries. They don't deal with the most conservative society or the most underprivileged individuals that exist in this world. This makes it very hard for them to win the debate because A, their case is contingent on their model, which is very vulnerable, as is pointed out by opening opposition, but B, they do not deal with the most impactful and vulnerable actors, which heavily decreases their significance in the round. We as closing government will fill in the opening with the following extensions. First, I'm going to explain why vulnerable people driven into coercive forms of marriages can better be saved on our side of the house. But secondly, even in the case that it does get coercive after marrying, why you can opt out easily on our side. Thirdly, I'm going to explain, even if we take opposition side at their best and concede that the status quo is really patriarchal and super conservative, why we saw this coercive norms around marriage itself uniquely on our side. And all rebuttals will be incorporated in my speech. First, let me characterize the status quo, right? We say that a lot of vulnerable people are driven into coercive forms of marriages, especially in the patriarchal societies that opening government fails to properly deal with, right? We say that a lot of patriarchal and abusive norms are pushed one way onto vulnerable individuals like women. For example, the fact the obligation that you have to do all the housework and take care of your child, for example, or that or phenomena where women are made financially dependent on their partners, or like you like suffering from like abuse or like domestic violence on a daily basis, for example, why are these issues not preventable on opposition side of the house? Two things. A, the victims probably internalize the fact that they deserve this treatment or situation, because when your partner tells you on a day-to-day basis that you chose to be in this marriage, or that it's your obligation to raise the child without any specific proof, that is the point in which women who are already in vulnerable position internalize the fact that yes, it is a consequence that they chose themselves into, or that they actually do deserve the treatment that they are suffering from on a day-to-day basis. But B, we also say that these kind of vulnerable individuals do not have any legal justification to escape that marriage on opposition side of the house, especially for the most invisible forms of coercion, which doesn't leave physical scars, but significantly limits your opportunity to get a job or to self-actualize. Ones that literally drive you into depression, for example, it's very hard for them to verbalize that you want a divorce because you're doing all the housework, for example, and like get consent from your partner or even to win in court in the first place. So we think that these patriarchal norms are very hard to change on opposition side of the house. Why then do we solve the situation on our side? But before I move on, I'll take a POI from opening. Okay, I'll move on. Okay, let me first.
Sorry. The coercion is simply worse on your side because you're providing further legalization and contracting for coercive families and friends to hold vulnerable individuals to more account versus a more open-ended, subjective internegotiations that give them a better chance to be able to escape when opportunities arrive.
Okay, look, the status quo. The fact of the matter is that there are always coercive actors who try to bring like really coercive, abusive obligations into a marriage. I'm going to explain later why uniquely on our side of the house, it's easier to opt out of those abusive obligations that are pushed on you when there's actually a legal framework. But let me first explain why on our side, we prevent conflicts from arising in the first place, right? The mechanism is that you don't get like faked into the marriage when the obligations or the consequences that you are facing as a result is written very clearly for you, right? When it's physically written down that one partner is obligated to do majority of the chores, you can more easily suspect that you're getting into a bad marriage, right? This doesn't require the experts that OG wants to talk about, which means that even in the most conservative situations, when men write the scenario 100%, for example, there's comparatively more chance that women can realize that the risks and actually opt out before they get into the marriage in the first place, right? But secondly, we also say that our side actually resolves the conflict better, even in the case that it gets coercive and you want to opt out, right? This is because of two reasons. First, we say that there's like an objective party who can identify who is at fault, right? Like, for example, the court or like the media or like public discourse, for example, can look at the written forms of obligations that the people like consented into and realize that, look, like one side didn't like force the other to do majority of the housework when they opted into the marriage. Therefore, they're like really making that overwork, which is outside the like what is written on like the in like the written form of like consent, for example. But secondly, we also say that crucially there's like legal justification for you to like file a divorce or to opt out of the marriage uniquely on our side, because you have like physical legal evidence that you are like forced to fulfill obligations that you have never consented to, for example. Or on the other hand, you can attack and point out that your partner is not fulfilling the responsibilities that they consented to initially in the marriage, right? But thirdly and finally, let me explain why we solve the coercive abusive norms around marriage itself, which takes opening opposition's context at best, right? We say that the procedure towards marriage becomes more written, it becomes more legal, right? This means that there's more connection with other forms of legal writing, like basic human rights in the Constitution, for example, the right to safety, the right to self-expression. The importance of this is that there's a higher possibility that writing like an abusive obligation that like you have to do all the housework without any rest, for example, can itself be banned more easily on our side of the house, right? When it's all about like customs and like patriarchal norms and tradition and pressure from your parents, it's very hard for the victims to find a legal route or find a solid, tangible route to like to explain that they are in a very coercive situation and to escape at the point in which you are able to connect the situation within the household to more legal written forms outside of the household, to things like basic human rights that everybody deserves. That is the point in which there's a higher chance that you could change those patriarchal norms, right? But secondly, we also say that you could get more connection with other values in other countries with maybe more liberalized or like more progressive forms of writing, right? Because it's easier to compare laws between different countries, for example. And like international media can also look at legal forms more easily. We think that it's much easier for them to actually point out if like the society that you are living in or the marriage that you were coerced into is actually abusive or not, right? Like opening opposition ultimately cannot just get away with their principal arguments saying that like there's no morally correct answer. Like some things cannot just be left arbitrary, right? Like basic rights, like a right to safety or the right to expression or the right to get a job that you want, they're like fundamental rights that everybody deserves. If we achieve that practical benefit much more on our side of the house, that is the point in which the entire principal argument that opening opposition relies their case on like loses significance within the round, right? Overall, like all of what we told you are important, because first, like there's more general happiness when you know the consequences and the marriage itself is more thought out. But we also say there's more self-actualization opportunities for the most vulnerable actors within this round. They're able to get a job. They're able to self-actualize better on our side. For all these reasons, we're very proud to propose.
I'd like to thank the member of government for that fine speech. We now invite the member of opposition to begin the closing op case. Here.
Hello, just testing to see if I am visible and audible.
Yes.
All right, POIs in the chat, please. I'll make sure to take at least 1 before 6. All right, starting my speech in 3. The claim of opening government was that people jumped into marriages irrationally and underprepared, and then there was a missing mechanism. And then there was the claim that people are better able to rationally prepare for marriage. But it was never clear why building and signing a contract is something that makes people more rational. What we will argue at closing opposition is that making people build and sign a contract when they are at their most irrational ensures that all toxicity and inequality in a relationship is permanently codified and signed, and that makes people in marriages worse off in every single context. 2-piece extension. Firstly, I'm going to explain why these contracts are likely to be toxic and unequal. Then explain how this is likely to entrench existing inequalities and those worse. First, on why these contracts are likely to be toxic. The first thing I would note is that most relationships in all contexts are unequal. And this is true for a number of reasons, whether that be based on class differences, social norms why one person is more desirable than another person, norms surrounding gender norms, or just most commonly, simply because one person likes the other person more than the other person likes them. And like simply a difference in the degrees of attraction oftentimes mean that the relationships by nature are not equal. And I would note that these inequalities exist further when it comes to discussions about marriage, because oftentimes one person wants marriage more than their partner, and one person is willing to give up more to get married than their partner is. And I would note almost often that this favors men over women because there's greater societal pressure for women to get married than there is for men, that this favors the upper class over the lower class because oftentimes the lower class is perceived to have more to be gained in that marriage than the higher class individuals are. And oftentimes that necessarily means that there's a power imbalance in the situation where you are deciding to get married. Why are the contracts in these situations bad? Because there's necessarily a clear power dynamic inside the relationship, the point at which you are signing that contract, and that is likely to permanently codify and make permanent that inequality. Because one side is necessarily able to demand more from that contract than the other person is, the point at which that contract is signed when there is inequality inside that power dynamic. One person is able to demand that their partner does more into the future in that relationship, into that marriage, and that partner is not able to resist that because they have more to be gained from that relationship, that partnership, or oftentimes because they just feel at the time irrationally they love their partner enough to give up those things and listen to those demands when they are at the point at which they are made, because they understand that there is a power dynamic inside that relationship, that they love their partner more, or because they want to get married so much that they are willing to give those conditions up at that point in time when that contract is being signed. And the problem is that those inequalities are now codified and signed and exist for permanence. Like what happens then is oftentimes inside that marriage, when those situations arise, these people are not able to fight against that, not able to demand that this is unequal, and are able to change that. Because closing government says that like people are able to point out that this is abusive and coercive, but the problem is that you've already signed that contract, and that by law, the idea is that you cannot go back against your word unless both people agree to it. And it's unlikely the other person is likely to agree that this contract is bad because that person benefits a lot more from that. And that necessarily means that it is unlikely that this leads to significant change. Why is our side better, and why is the lack of contract better? The first thing I was noted is that most of these inequalities are far more likely to be resolved over time. For instance, the idea that one person wants a marriage more does not matter the point at which you are already married, and therefore there's a lot less of that inequality in that situation. The idea of a change in affection oftentimes happens over time. Like it's not less likely to be the case that like one person continuously likes the other person when the other person does, those things become more equal over time as time passes, and often things change as time passes, which often means that power dynamics can change as time passes, and people can work those differences out on our side of the house. Not necessarily, like oftentimes if it's a question of like lower class versus upper class, those inequalities are bridged to the point at which those like the assets are combined and like shared, which oftentimes happens when marriages happen. So like that inequality becomes reduced after marriage does happen. And oftentimes that means necessarily that those inequalities are less of an issue on our side of the house, and those inequalities inside that relationship are likely to be resolved naturally after marriage happens as time progresses, as long as that those like inequalities are not codified and signed. The problem with the gov bench is that the point which that is written in a contract is difficult to combat that. The closing government claim here that like you cannot fight against abusive situations where the partner is making you do all the housework is untrue, because it's likely that you're able to fight against that if it is never said that you agree to this, that this kind of abuse in this version is not something that you signed up to, as opposed to when your partner can literally send you a copy of the contract where you literally sign that you're willing to do all that to make this marriage happen. I would say that that is something that we can far better change and combat on our side of the house. Opening.
Power dynamic is a wash because it won't disappear with or without this agreement. At least under gov, when you violate the contract, you divorce and ask for compensation. In your world, people are forced to stay together, albeit being incompatible.
I get the point. It's not symmetric because it is literally signed and codified. Like literally, even if there is a bridging power dynamic, the contract that was built upon that power dynamic is still there, and you still have to act on it. That is the major delta that oftentimes means that these people are entrenched in unequal relationship and unequal marriages. I would say further, like the best response that we get from opening government to this is that experts exist. I would say experts are not sufficient. Firstly, because oftentimes it's like not everyone has access to like the best lawyers on earth. But secondly, I'd also just say that it's unclear why lawyers have the incentive to focus on making marriage work rather as opposed to just representing the interests of an individual. If one individual is able to get more from a contract, I said the lawyer would hope that individual gain more from that contract, demand greater concessions if they can, and often that would lead to inequalities happening. It's unclear why lawyers are good at this. The second thing I want to then talk about is why this is likely to entrench existing inequalities. Opening government told you that there will be data on what most contracts would look like. I would argue that this is terrible because insofar as society, there is inequalities within relationships, and there are norms around what is desirable and what is not desirable. It is likely that it will be clear in data that some people who have, like, if you are a man, you are like systematically or historically, like based on data, like statistically, more likely to get these things in return for your spouse. If you are of a higher class individual or a middle upper class, you're far more likely to be able to get these concessions from your partner. And those things are written literally in contracts, and those are things are data like made into data and made into statistics. The reason this is problematic is because it is then clear that certain people in society are able to demand more from marriages. Is quite clear that certain groups and certain identity groups are more able to get demands from these partners, which oftentimes firstly sets in stone a norm based on what kind of person is more desirable, what kind of person is less desirable, and oftentimes makes it very clear, makes that kind of thing difficult to challenge the point which there as statistics. But furthermore, I would also just argue that this makes more relationships into the future worse, because oftentimes people are able to look at those statistics, recognize I am a man, I can demand these things from my partner because other people have done it too, and they've worked. And oftentimes that this makes marriages in general far more equal into the future. It has been a great honor to represent Korea University in the Northeast Asian Grand Finals. So proud to oppose.
We thank the member of opposition for that fine speech. We now invite the government whip to close out the government bench for us. Hear. Gov whip.
Yes. I prefer POIs vocally, please. My time will start in 3, 2, 1. I'll start firstly with CO. So we say CO is virtually like spent a lot of time on why this contract writing process is going to be irrational. We say this is simply like a rehash of OO, and we say that like we're going to spend less time on CO. And also another failure of CO is that they did not provide effective alternative to dealing with post-marital conflicts, which was our main case from closing government. We say at this point they lose out of this debate. So let me deal with their points one by one. So firstly, about like the POI they provided against against the opening half about the possibility of like deception, right? Like people don't don't necessarily have like enough legal knowledge. Firstly, like we say like in our best case, like experts can like personalize these contracts as much as possible to like these individuals, but also we say that even if it was not personalized, still it is hard, like based on expert knowledge. Like you don't, like for example, you don't have to know about every single clause of your insurance contract in order to like gain the benefits from it, right? We say in the same way, like even if it's not absolutely personalized, like and it's a perfect contract, we say that can still be beneficial because it can be a viable way to avoid and also navigate out of conflicts peacefully. And another thing that the CEO says is about like experts are like not reliable anyway. Firstly, we told you this is from OG also talked about this, but like there are statistics exist, and also we say there's going to be more and more examples as time proceeds. But also we say that even if it was not perfect, and even if not all conflicts were preventable, we still say it is as long as there are more. We say as long as we can comparatively better resolve conflicts, like in the mechanism that my partner told you, we say that's a better world that we should prefer. And finally, about irrational contracts and like women being likely to be coerced into like slightly disadvantaged, like sorry about like the positive matter that thirdly about the positive matter that CEO is brought out about like natural change. We say this was like as optimistic as like the couple that's about to marry in this closing oppositions world, right? Because we don't understand why the natural change is going to happen. We say like that's sort of like we say like at the point where like you have to start from like deciding on the process of the concept conflict resolution. We say that is a much more laborious and also emotionally tiring and stressful process. And whereas on our side we can simply like there's a clear-cut line to these contracts and these marital relationships can be easily dealt with. And okay, but okay, then fine. Moving on to OG, we say OG was in the opening half. We say OG was relatively the less important because they were only arguing in the context of where they wanted to argue in, right? 4 things to say about OG. So firstly, unlike closing governments, like we told them, they never provided like impacts or mechanisms on like how they can deal with post-marital conflicts better on their side, right? But secondly, we say like they never explained like why this like saves the most vulnerable of actors, which is women living in conservative parts of the world, as opening opposition rightly pointed out. But thirdly, we say OG is like arguing only in the context of like women being socially privileged, like in liberal democratic countries, like who on both sides presumably won't get into trouble anyway. So we say these are these are like the least affected, like the comparatively least less affected like actors, right? And we say CG was much more charitable than OG when we provided analysis, we like this critical winning analysis against like for like the government bench by engaging with the best case and the best context coming from the opposition bench. But fourthly, we said OG did not provide mechanism on how this service would be accessible as much as possible to everyone, right? Despite their impacts being contingent on it, that was something that we did from closing government. Okay, so then moving on, opening opposition. Yeah, I'll take your view.
The problem with how constrictive your mechanism is that you're not only reminded it every time you or your partner brings it up, you're reminded of it every time you or your partner even thinks about it, every time you see them, every time you think of marriage. It becomes a reminder of the contract, which prevents your own growth and the healthy growth of the relationship.
Okay, so 4 things to say. I'll say that in my third part. Okay, so firstly, 4 things to say against OO. So we say that OO, like firstly on like the resolution of like on the way, of like conservative societies. Firstly on this point, so we say patriarchal context can contracts can exist in like as opening opposition wants to point out, right? But like no, because at this point, like it is explicitly written, it's more likely to be averted because women will not like consent into that sort of contract in the first place. But even if it doesn't happen, it's still easy to criticize because now that it's visible, because these patriarchal unfair clauses will be existed, it will be visible, it will be much more easier to criticize on our side. That's why we provided you we provided you 3 ways, which is because that's why, because of like this visibility, you can the government agencies can inspect into like violations and sanction offenders accordingly, but also secondly, like domestic and international media can criticize, and we say nations have improved like their social image and have incentive to improve like their social systems and their social cultures little by little, like Saudi Arabia, for example. But thirdly, we say like most most importantly, like because this threat is visible, women can opt out of the contract because the risk, because they can see the risk, right? That is a crucial exclusive benefit on our side. Okay, B, about secondly about conflict resolution. We say, so the opening bench best case is about like how's there going to be change of emotions, change of environments, and things weren't meant to be like this, and that happens, right? But like firstly, like I listened to the opening government. They talked about like in their model about how you can change it. And also that because we told you that, from my partner told you that because the process of change is stipulated and consented upon, like on your side, like whereas you have to like firstly start off with like how to resolve the conflict, on our side how that process is already like decided, right? You can get straight into the substantive matter without like this like unnecessary unproductive argument. But also conflict reservation in the op world, like there's no logical justification and evidence on which side neither party can argue, right? Like I thought, like if the woman says like I thought you were not engaging in legal activities, she cannot provide any logical justification. The only logical fact remains is that you consented to the marriage full stop. But C, about the POI, right? About trivial stress, right? We said this, they said it's stressful because you have to like follow every single day. It's going to be pessimistic. But we say like value judgment change every day. Like it's actually this system kind of exists in Islamic countries, but also like read through documents every day and write things are like, but no, like these rights are pretty basic stuff, like pay tuition for your children, for example. Like either way, we say like this impact is marginal compared to preventing post-marital conflicts, which is likely to be extremely emotional and bloody, like sentiments, betrayal, and rage resulting in like severe mental depression and even suicide. But finally, about discourage from marriage, we say like this is good because you avoid like your career being destroyed, your life being destroyed. We avoid the reproduction with retrospective affirmation of like these extremely like patriarchal marriages. That's because it's visible, it's easy to criticize, because society is easier to change. We're very happy.
We'd like to thank the government whip for that fine speech. We now invite the opposition whip to close out this debate for us. Hear, hear. Opposition whip.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, extending my timer. Okay, starting my speech in 3. I think that the reason why the closing opposition's extension is the most important thing in this debate is because our extension is can be applied to the largest amount of context that all the teams are trying to talk about, right? So I think that the context that we bring to you about how in relationships are generally not likely to be a very fair, like not the two relationships are likely to have the same amount of negotiation power when it comes to your partner. I think that this doesn't only apply to the context that other teams want to talk about, like i.e. conservative societies or liberal societies or whatnot, but this is true for every single relationship, I would say, for the vast majority of cases, right? And we're not only talking about things like gender norms or like gender norms about like whether you're a woman or you're a man, but we're talking about more nuanced issues that are prevalent in the society, right? Things like whether or not you're privileged, whether or not you're like whether or not you have a lot of money, whether or not you're like social status or whatnot, whether or not which partner wants to marry more or which partner likes you more, right? I think that all of these factors are the reasons why marriage agreements before you actually opt into marriage is likely to be unfair to begin with. But the problem of this is that the point at which these things are codified is the point at which you cannot solve these problems as long as you opt into these things, right? But then secondly, I think that the take from closing government regarding this is that this is not likely to be true because there are experts that are here to like examine your contract or whatnot. I would say that these factors don't always have to be the things that are like seem to be really, really abusive or really, really problematic, but also the more nuanced things that go on within a marriage, right? About who should like contribute more to housework or who should contribute more when it comes to economic stuff, right? So I think that, and I think that the point at which your spouse can say that you agree to this, we signed this contract, is the point at which you don't have the ability to speak against this, and that this is the point where all of the internalization about what like you're inferior or one is likely to propagate under their side of the bench, right? So firstly, I'm going to deal a little bit more with the closing government, and then opening government, and then I'm going to wear a case against opening opposition. So firstly, I think that the closing government basically talks about how opting out is easier when it comes to divorce and whatnot, right? The first response I have to this is that if the society norms is as coercive as the closing government wants to opt in, I would say that one, probably the contract would be skewed towards patriarchal norms or societal norms anyways, because obviously the people who are examining your like contract or people who are around you surrounding how talking about how contracts should go are patriarchal anyways. But secondly, and more importantly, if these people are like really coercive, I think that this is marginal at best, because in these contexts, the reason why divorce is difficult isn't because women can't particularly voice out, but is because like they can't voice out because of things like economic dependence, or they're worried about their children, or like they think your partner still loves you, or whatever reasons that might be, right? So I think that the effect of opting out is marginal at best coming from the closing government, right? But secondly, I think that this is also worse coming from their side of the bench, because the question about who actually takes the blame in this context is skewed or is unfair to the people who have less societal capital or less privilege to voice out, right? Why is this? Because when it comes to in the status quo, your objections, under their world, when you have objections towards the contract, it's likely to be more disadvantageous towards you, because even when the contract was unfair in the starting point, your spouse or your partner is likely to say that you're the one who's not keeping the contract, you're the one who is like opting out, and therefore you should be held more accountable. I think that this makes processes in which divorce happens much difficult, right? But secondly, they talked about like coercive norms within the society around marriage and how they can like solve these things. I think that comparing is actually impossible from like conservative societies to most liberal societies, right? Because one, I think that when it comes to really, really conservative societies, there's likely to be more media control or more control about which social norms should be sanctioned around this. But secondly, and more importantly, I think that the process of change is stopped, but because the point at which there are like these strong norms that how a contract should be made, and this contract is like showed to every person in that society, that is the point where even the most liberal individuals are likely to opt out of this. OG, I'll take you right now.
Your only mechanism on why it wasn't a situation is because of legal ammunition. It's assertive because you assume that legality will always fail. If that is true, how do you solve power dynamic in your world given the fact that women will still always suffer? Obviously, this debate has to happen in a middle ground.
I think we gave you sufficient mechanisms about how most of the imbalances when it comes to power is likely to be resolved when you don't codify things, but time passes as you marriage, right? So we talked about things like how when time passes, people are usually like seek to bridge the gaps between like, for example, financial assets, or for example, like how you demand more from your partner because like you like your partner more, all of these things. I think that you like need to engage with, yeah. So secondly, I want to talk about the OG's case about how you can have this rational talk before your partner and like all of these good things, right? So I think that our extension is important because it's fundamentally engaging, and it flips the OG's case about why this is actually bad, right? Because I think that the point at which there are signed codified social contracts according to the social norms is the point at which you compare yourselves with other couples on very quantifiable traits, right? So for example, when set on norm that usually in this country women do all the housework, that is the point of which like even the most like liberal men are likely to think that, oh, maybe I should demand these things to like my spouse or whatsoever because most of the people are doing it, so maybe it's legit for me to do it also, right? So I think that this is bad because it even stops the people who want to progress at the end of the day to actually like change these measures, because now the point at which you actually are signing a contract like before your marriage is the point at which your expert or the legal people around you or all of the other contract that signed around you says that you should do these things or says that you should demand ABC things to your partner. I think that this is bad because one, I think that this strengthens the power imbalance or the like things that are already existent in the society, and this actually deters the social change that is likely to happen because social norms don't change when there is a contract to like change these things, but more likely when the actions of people actually change on the ground, right? And I think that this is significantly hard because like these actions are unlikely to change, the point of which you now see how the social norm is visually before you actually opt into marriage and actually like opt into those norms by yourselves. But more importantly, I think that this actually harms the more vulnerable people on the ground at the end of the day, right? So And thirdly, I think that the OG simply like asserts that, for example, for some reason, your rational talk with your partner before your marriage will solve all of the nitty-gritty problems before your marriage. I think that one, this is not likely to happen because thinking you can do something and actually doing something is actually different, because like you only like think that maybe you can wash the dishes every day, but that may be hard. But secondly, and more importantly, I think that like you have a lesser understanding of what these things are likely to mean. So the reason why we outweigh opening opposition in this debate is because the opening opposition only focuses on like the principal reasons, or why like there is a power imbalance, which can be true in some context, like men and women like contexts, which can be true in some contexts and not true in some other contexts, right? We think that we mechanize why this is likely to happen in the vast majority of relationships we're more than proud to oppose.
We thank the opposition for that fine speech. We thank all speakers for that very fine debate. Okay, now